The Roan came in on a Thursday. Pete Alderman brought it up from the Cimarron bottom in a rope trailer, and by the time he got it into my breaking pen, the horse had already put a gash in the trailer boards and bitten clean through a lead rope. 3 men on the fence watching. Pete grinning, because he'd already told half the town he'd sell it to whoever could ride it first, $50 to the winner, and Pete Alderman never offered $50 on anything he thought somebody might actually collect. I'd been running the Calloway spread for 11 years by then. Not my land. Frank Calloway's land, Frank Calloway's cattle, Frank Calloway's name on the gate. I was just the man who kept it from falling down. Good enough with horses that people drove 2 days to have me look at their animals. Not good enough, apparently, to be worth much else. Frank paid me $40 a month and a roof over a tack room, and when Frank died in the spring, he left the whole spread to a nephew in St. Louis who'd never set foot west of the Mississippi. The nephew sold it. So I had the tack room until the new owner arrived, and I had the breaking pen, and I had the Roan, and I had Pete Alderman's $50 standing between me and nothing much in particular. I watched the horse for a while before I went in. That's the first thing you watch, most men don't. The Roan was a mare 4 years old, some Comanche blood in her by the look of the head, broad between the eyes, short-coupled, built low and powerful. She'd been mishandled, not starved, not beaten, but grabbed at, yanked, confused. She didn't trust the ground she was standing on. Every time she moved, she was checking her corners. That's a different animal than a mean horse. Mean horses are simple. A horse that doesn't trust the ground, that takes time and quiet and a willingness to be patient in a way most men aren't patient. I had time, didn't have much else. Pete said, "You going in, or you just gonna look at her all day, Holt?" I didn't answer him. I unlatched the gate. There were maybe 8 people watching by then. Word travels in a small town when something might go wrong in an interesting way. The 3 men on the fence had become 8. And one of them was a woman I didn't know standing apart from the others, not up on the fence but on the ground beside it, with one hand on the top rail and her weight shifted to her right side in a way that told me her left leg gave her trouble. She was watching the horse the same way I'd been watching it. I noticed that, filed it away. The Roan ran the pen twice, then stopped and watched me from the far end. I stood still, didn't look at her direct, just stood there in the center of the pen like I had nowhere to be, which was true enough. Pete hollered something, I didn't hear what. After a while the mare took a step toward me, stopped, took another. I turned a quarter turn away from her, which is not what most men do, and she came up behind me slow and put her nose on my shoulder blade and blew out a long breath. I heard someone on the fence say hell. I reached back slow and laid my hand on her jaw. That was that, not $50 drama, just a horse that needed to be heard before she'd listen. The woman's name was Clara Marsh. I learned that 2 hours later when Pete paid me the $50 and most of the crowd drifted off toward the saloon to argue about what they'd seen. She came over to the pen where I was rubbing the mare down, and she said, "You watched her before you went in." I said I did. She said most men don't. I said I knew that. There was a pause and she looked at the mare, and the mare turned her head toward her, curious. Clara put her hand out flat and the Roan sniffed it and didn't pull back. Clara said, "She's not mean, not a question." I said no, just scared for a long time. She looked at me then. I was still looking at the horse. She said, "I know what that is." I didn't say anything to that. Sometimes the right thing is to not say anything. She'd come in from the Oklahoma Territory 6 weeks before, she told me. Her husband had died of a fever in March. They'd been homesteading, 3 years out there, and then it was just her and a wagon and a mule and the winter claim that turned out to be on disputed land anyway. She'd walked more of the way than she'd ridden. The leg was an old thing, a childhood fall, not the journey, though the journey hadn't helped. She was staying at the Widow Prute's boarding house. She had $42 and a mule, and she was looking for work of any kind. which in this town in the spring of 1883 meant laundry or cooking or mending and nothing else, because that was the map of what a woman alone could do without being talked about. I told her what I knew, which wasn't much. The laundry took women on sometimes. The hotel needed kitchen help. She nodded, said thank you, started to go. I said, you're good with horses. She stopped, turned, said I was raised around them. My father bred quarter horses in Kentucky. I said, the new owner of this spread's coming out from St. Louis in 3 weeks. He's going to need someone who knows what they're doing. I'm going to tell him he needs a horse manager and a cook both. Whether that's one person or two, I can't say. She looked at me for a long beat, not calculating, thinking, there's a difference. She said, is that a real offer or are you being kind? I said, I don't have the luxury of being kind for its own sake right now. She almost smiled, not quite. She said, all right. The nephew's name was Gerald Calloway, and he arrived on a Tuesday on the afternoon stage looking like a man who had never in his life been rained on. City suit, soft hands, the kind of eyes that are always doing arithmetic. He walked the property with me for 2 hours and asked good questions, better than I'd expected, and wrote things in a small leather notebook. He asked about the woman. I told him what I'd told her, horse manager, cook, knows the work, won't complain. I left out the rest of it, which was that in 3 weeks she'd quietly become the person I talked to at the end of the day, which was a thing I hadn't done with anyone in longer than I could account for. Gerald Calloway looked at his notebook, said, and you vouch for her? I said yes. He said, that good enough for me. I'm not a horse man. He looked at me then, Gerald did, said, my uncle wrote about you, in his papers. He said you were the best man he'd ever had and the most underpaid. He said it plain, like it was just a fact he was reporting. I intend to correct that if you'll stay on. I didn't say anything for a moment. I looked out at the breaking pen where the Roan was moving easy, no longer checking her corners. I said, I'll stay. Clara and I didn't have a moment, not a grand one. That's not how it went. What happened was this. Late October, after the first cold snap, I came back from checking the north fence line in the dark, and there was a lamp lit in the barn, and she was in with the Roan, which had started favoring a foreleg, and she'd cleaned the hoof and packed it and was sitting on an overturned bucket in the lamplight with her bad leg stretched out in front of her, and her head tipped back against the stall boards, tired. She heard me come in. She said without opening her eyes, she'll be fine by Thursday. I said, I know, I saw the pack. Quiet for a while, the horse moved. Wind hit the barn boards. She said, Holt, do you know what people in town say about you? I said I could guess. She said, they say you're a hard man who keeps to himself and probably always will. She opened her eyes and looked at me. I think they're about half right. I said, which half? She said, you keep to yourself, but I don't think it's because you want to. I stood there in the barn door with the cold coming in behind me. She was looking at me the way she'd looked at the Roan that first day, patient, without agenda, like she already knew what she was looking at and wasn't afraid of it. I said, Clara. She said, I know. I sat down on the barn floor across from her, back against the opposite wall, and we stayed there while the lamp burned down, not talking much, the horse breathing slow between us. And after a while she reached across and put her hand on my boot, just rested it there, and I looked down at her hand and didn't move, and that was the whole of it. Sometimes the whole of something is very small and very true. That was 19 years ago now. The Roan's granddaughter is in the far pasture. She's got the same broad head, same low build, same Comanche blood in the lines. Clara's out there with her most mornings. She still limps. She's still the only person I've ever known who watches before she goes in. Gerald Calloway gave me the North 40 in the 4th year, said it was owed. I built a house on it. Nothing grand. 4 rooms and a good roof and a porch that faces west so we can watch the light go. I don't know what anyone in town says about me anymore. I stopped listening somewhere around the time I realized I didn't need them to see me clearly, because one person did, and she chose to stay. She's coming in from the pasture now. I can see her across the field, one hand on the fence rail, moving easy in the morning. The coffee's on. That's enough, that's more than enough.